Both the Celtic and the Germanic peoples thrived throughout northern and western Europe for centuries, but nearly all of those European nations today from Scandinavia all the way down to the Iberian Peninsula exist because Germanic peoples marched in after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. But does this mean that the Germans were stronger or more militarily sophisticated than the Celts? Not necessarily. In fact, many Roman authors frequently mentioned the fact that the Celts were more civilized, sophisticated, and organized than their Germanic counterparts. But if that's the case, then how did Rome seem to conquer them so easily while struggling for centuries until finally losing out against the Germans? Well, that answer can be summed up into three words: diplomacy, geography, and timing. If you read Julius Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic Wars, he repeatedly describes the Gauls as being wealthy, politically sophisticated individuals capable of great internal structure regarding laws, religion, social hierarchies. He claims that they lived in civilized, fortified towns and they had advanced long-distance trade networks. To the Romans, their world was not all that primitive or barbaric, but diplomatically, they were a disaster. They lived in dozens of independent tribes with their own king or chieftain, and they were constantly at war with one another. There was no central permanent authority figure, and they fed right into the Roman strategy of divide and conquer. They literally divided themselves, so all Rome had to do was come in and conquer. Even when Vercingetorix was able to briefly unite the Gauls in 52 BC, Caesar writes that this was fragile and mostly dependent on personal charisma, not actual political structure. And once Caesar defeated him at Alesia, it all fell apart because one man cannot control an entire network of feuding tribes. The Germans, on the other hand, were often considered by the Romans to be very barbaric and uncivilized, living in primitive conditions with no cities or any interest in life's luxuries or any of the goods that Rome had to offer. But they did possess one advantage that the Celts did not, and that is that they were capable of forming massive wartime confederations. The greatest example of this is the Battle of Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD, where Arminius was capable of uniting multiple Germanic tribes to form a coalition strong enough to defeat 3 Roman legions. Similar confederations can be seen all throughout the German world, with tribes like the Goths and the Vandals and the Lombards who are all able to come together and sack Rome throughout different periods in history. Geography also plays a huge role in this, as the Celts primarily lived in locations that were more easily accessible to Roman armies and of greater interest to Rome in general. Germania, on the other hand, was a logistical nightmare. The Germans lived in thick, dense forests and wet marshlands that made it nearly impossible for the Romans to effectively access. Because of this, the territory was seemingly useless to the Romans because there was no good farmland for cultivating and taxing. There were no cities or fortifications that were worth capturing. Caesar even plainly states that Germania was not worth conquering because it had no value to Rome. Which leads us into the final nail in the coffin, which is migration timing. See, the Celts had migrated into their various locations and established themselves long before the Germans ever did. In fact, they were establishing themselves in their civilizations at roughly the same time that Rome was coming into power. So rather unfairly, the Celts were up against Rome when she was at her strongest, and the larger Germanic confederations did not move into these areas until Rome was already weakening and in decline. This made it relatively simple for the various Germanic tribes to move in and take over. The Anglo-Saxons took the territory of the Britons, the Franks took the territory of the Gauls, the Visigoths took the territory of the Celtiberians, the Ostrogoths and Lombards took the territory of the Italians, and so on and so on. So you see, it wasn't that the Celts were weak or lacked ambition, and it's not that the Germans were necessarily some grand superpower the empire had never seen before. It is simply a matter of diplomacy, geography, and timing, of which the Germans seem to have come out on top. Except for Ireland, Scotland, Brittany, and Wales, of course. But if you are interested in learning more about how this grand story played out from the very beginnings of the Yamnaya migrations all the way to the present day, you can go watch the full-length video that I've just posted on my YouTube channel. Make sure that you subscribe for part 2, where we dive into Eastern and Southern Europe so you can see how Rome rose herself.